All right. I've been thinking about sort of what it's like to be a mind in the universe, and specifically about how individual minds, like people basically, tend to seem to gravitate towards uh, a single identity, and how that feels narrow and it feels limiting. And I feel like as society progresses into the future, we will need more and more people to become not only open to other perspectives, but capable of embodying multiple perspectives at once. And this comes from my experience growing up within a very sort of rigid ideology about how the world works and what's right and wrong, and just a lot of rigidity around those concepts. And I think my path out of that happened because I always had sort of a counter theory in my mind where I was able to have what I thought, but also have a different thought, right? Like what I'm being told, but also what's potentially the opposition to this thought, right? Or this worldview. And so for me, my progression of worldview basically began with what I was taught, but then I gradually built up sort of this counter worldview, I guess. And then I think that became a habit because now I find myself in a place where my mind is sort of open, and I think that's something that's really valuable, though it presents new challenges. But it's basically a space where your mind exists as sort of a space that you have, right? You have access to your mind. But if you fill your entire mind with one perspective, that takes up your mental space. And then if you try to add another perspective, you can't, because you would have to take away from your current perspective. And so if you've got any number of variables that feel like they force you to keep your perspective, then you're not going to be able to be flexible and basically incorporate a new perspective. And so I think the skill that I practiced was just scaling the perspective. It's like you've got a mind that's like an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and you've got a shape in there. And like your perception of truth is like how big the shape is, but there's only so much space. So, if you start off as a child and your mind is empty, and the people around you basically create this shape in your mind and they increase its size to the point where it's the biggest thing in your mind, then whenever someone tries to add another shape into your mind, it'll bump up against the existing shape, and then you sort of have this feeling of incongruence because you have that internal struggle, right? And you're like, well, I don't know which one to accept. Do I accept the one I started with, or do I accept this one that I'm being told now? Which one's the right one? Do I stay the way I am? Do I throw away what I am? Do I become something new? But ultimately, each of us, as the final judge of what we possess in our minds and what we put there, ultimately we have to scale those shapes, adjust their sizes and their orientations on our own. We're the ultimate judge of what we think about and how we perceive the world, which descriptions of right and wrong we follow, which perspectives about how the future is going to be, which judgments about what actions are going to be most important for us. We're all thinking that, and we're all making that choice. Even if we're choosing to submit to an authority, we are still consciously choosing which authority to submit to, or giving up possibly by submitting to whichever authority influences us at the given time, which probably is a pretty obvious mistake to make, but it's something that happens, right? So ultimately, you find yourself with this mind, and you have this space, and you have these shapes. And so what I found, I think I did, and I don't know if this is accurate, but I think that instead of destroying or throwing away the shape that I grew up with, basically, I think I scaled it back. I made it smaller. And that's hard to do because you lose some resolution, right? Like when you take a perspective and it's the only thing in your mind, you have explanations for every aspect that someone could kind of push on it, and those explanations go really deep. But at the same time, you're not able to look at the perspective they are bringing in high resolution. And so for me personally, that was a challenge for me, because when I spoke to someone with a different perspective, and this was emphasized, which was good because it helped me see how other people see the world, which ultimately helped me see the world. When you look at someone else's perspective, the only way for you to see their perspective in detail is to actually let your own perspective shrink a little bit. And there's no other way. Like if you hold on to your perspective while they are speaking, that holding on to your perspective is literally ignoring the words that are coming out of their mouth. Because if you listen to their words, you would create a new perspective, right? And you would begin to see this new perspective in higher detail. So I think that was a major takeaway, because ultimately, truly listening to somebody allows you to create new shapes in your mind. And for me, that's really important, because I want to know everything, I want to see every perspective. I want to know every viewpoint. And I don't want to know what the viewpoint looks like from my perspective. I want to actually know what it feels like to be inside of that perspective. So I want to genuinely understand every perspective, right? And it's just not an easy thing to do. The only way to do that is to shrink your own. But what I found myself doing is I find myself in a place now where I've spoken to so many people and I've heard so many ideas. I feel like I have a bunch of tiny shapes, and each one is different and unique and special. And it also feels like each one of those shapes is something that I could choose as my guiding principle for my life, and it could become my entire personality. But what I actually want to do is sort of be able to look at each one of them. It feels almost as if it feels like these perspectives, it feels like each one of them is true, but it feels like we're all imperfect people trying to piece together reality. And it feels like every mind branches off and has its own history, its own story, its own feelings, its own thoughts, its own hopes, its own fears. And it feels like we are all part of this entity, which is humanity. And it feels like we're all like branches on a tree, spreading out, each one of us looking at our entire life and our entire history and everything we do every day. And all of that we see feeds into each one of our perspectives. And so what's just really hard to tell is what is truth, right? What is the true perspective? And I think that a tree analogy is a good analogy, because that's how I think about society. If you look at a tree and you say, show me the branch that is true, there's no answer. Maybe the only truth you could say is that there's a central trunk which points towards the sky. And I believe that is also true of humanity. If you say, show me the perspective that a human holds that is true, that's a random branch on the tree. It could be pointing any direction. How do you know what's true? What's true is that the sum of all human perspectives when witnessed through history, have a trend in a direction. Whatever that direction is, that is truth. That truth is subjective within our species. It has to be, But that truth is what it means to be human. And that in and of itself, even though it's our entire species, it's just a branch, because every species has that trait. Every species is pushing against the universe and spending its entire life adapting to the universe. So even though all of humanity is that giant shape, that giant structure being calculated into the future, it's just one more branch on this giant phylogenetic tree. And so what it means to be human is a pretty big question, right? It involves understanding every perspective, or at least trying to, and understanding the trend of all human perspectives over time and the evolution of them over time. But understanding what it means to be alive is a much deeper question, because to understand what it means to be alive, you have to become aware of how humanity fits into the larger tree of life, which I think is a very interesting thing to look at. And even beyond that, you have to look at what it means to exist. But I think that's the heart of it. The heart of it is that tree structure of all human thinking, and it's that 8.5 by 11 piece of paper you have to work with. And it's that understanding that it's worth it to let your own perspective go for a little while in order to truly listen to someone, in order to see their perspective, and to be able to hold in your mind at the same time the way you see the world and the way someone else sees the world. Because I believe that in holding those two perspectives and being able to think about those two perspectives without judging one as right and one as wrong, I believe that is what makes us better people. And my goal for my own life is to explore all of these different shapes I have in my head, all of these different identities. They feel like identities, and I want to explore them all simultaneously. I want to be a Renaissance man with a bunch of interests and a bunch of things that I can speak about, similar to how when you hear a famous character or a celebrity talk about something, a lot of people have a persona about themselves, and eventually you realize that's just who they are, and it doesn't change very much. And my goal is to be able to have multiple of those personas. I want to be able to have part of me that understands one thing, and part of me that understands something else, and something else, and I want to be able to speak from each of those interests and each of those understandings without necessarily worrying whether or not they agree with each other. Yeah, that's the goal. And yeah, the goal is basically open-mindedness. I think open-mindedness is good. I think we should be open-minded people, and we should be able to look at and listen to the people around us, which I think everyone already thinks. But I guess maybe I'm just realizing it.